One person cannot change the world, but one person carrying the raw truth about death can make the whole world go silent. At an age when most rock stars from his generation are already lying in cemeteries or remembered as fully closed legends, Vince Neil is still here, not as a winner, but as a survivor after too many funerals in his own life. Happiness ended a long time ago. He buried his daughter, watched friends die from accidents, addiction, and time, and kept living with a death he didn't cause, but has carried for life like a sentence without parole. He lost his voice, lost the body that used to be a weapon, lost the glorious image the public once worshipped, and lost even the right to grow old quietly. Now, when death is no longer an abstract concept, but something present in every labored breath, every slow step on stage, Vince Neil blurts out something that startles people. He wants it to end. Not as a cry for help, not as a melodramatic act, but as a weary statement from someone who has gone too far and too long in the war with himself. When death is mentioned, he doesn't tremble, doesn't dodge, doesn't try to paint it with meaning. That calm cuts through decades of noise with a cold honesty, because for those who have lost enough, death is no longer as scary as continuing to carry memories that can't be fixed. Vince Neil knows what the lowest points of life feel like, knows the feeling of losing a child with no words strong enough to fill that void, and from that moment on, every other collapse is just an aftershock. But what led an American rock rebel icon, who once lived as if tomorrow didn't exist, to this harsh state of acceptance, where death is no longer the enemy, but a possibility waiting in the wings? The answer isn't in a scandal, isn't in a ridiculed performance, it's deep in a life built on one wrong choice after another, impulsive moments paid for in blood and tears, and losses heavy enough to break anyone weaker. This isn't a beautified version of Vince Neil's story, not a tale of redemption or salvation. This is the raw truth about what happens when life takes away everything that once made you believe you were untouchable. It's the story of a man who gradually realized that sometimes the greatest courage isn't continuing to scream to prove you're still alive, but accepting that it's time to stop fighting the ending. And the journey to that bleak calm began a very long time ago, long before the name Vince Neil became a familiar scream in wild nights of music, long before he even realized that some losses, once they happen, follow a person all the way to their final breath. If you want to understand what really brought Vince Neil to this cold acceptance, subscribe to the channel and keep following the story behind the lights. Vince Neil's youth didn't carry the classic tragedy outline that people easily sympathize with: no extreme poverty, no beatings at home, no childhood crushed by violence or deprivation, and precisely because of that, the emptiness inside him was more dangerous, more silent, and harder to name, because it didn't come from being deprived, but from never being shaped. Vince Neil grew up in an outwardly comfortable environment, where no one told him what was too much, what was the stopping point, what was the line between living it up and self-destruction. And when a child grows up without boundaries, they don't learn to control desire, they only learn to chase the next stronger feeling. He wasn't forced to grow up early, but he also wasn't taught how to stand firm when no one was clapping. No one showed him how to face uncomfortable emotions, boredom, the quiet moments normal life always carries. So very early on, Vince Neil learned a wrong but effective lesson: just turn up the volume, speed things up, increase the stimulation, and every uncomfortable feeling gets drowned out. Joy came to him fast like a spark, a party, a cheer, an admiring glance, but it vanished just as quickly, leaving a deeper, colder void behind. And each time, Vince Neil didn't try to understand why he felt empty, he just learned to find a stronger hit to fill it. His youth therefore wasn't built on values or long-term goals, but on a chain of instant reactions, where emotions were resolved not by reflection, but by extreme action, where everything could be pushed to the edge as long as it made him feel alive. In that world, meaning didn't matter as much as feeling, depth didn't matter as much as intensity, and calm was seen as a threat rather than a destination. Vince Neil wasn't running from pain, because he never really understood what pain was. He was running from emptiness, and that's a far more dangerous enemy, because it doesn't scream, doesn't bleed, but it gnaws away bit by bit, forcing people to keep seeking stronger and stronger stimulants, just to feel they exist. It was during this period, before fame, before stage lights, before Mötley Crüe, that Vince Neil unconsciously built a survival mechanism, based on extremes, where every emotion had to be pushed to the max, where there was no room for enough. And when someone lives like that long enough, they lose the ability to tolerate normalcy. That youth didn't leave visible scars, but it planted a crooked foundation, where self-worth was measured by how much attention you got, where joy only meant something if it was loud, and where silence became unbearable. Looking back, it wasn't the youth of someone cruelly mistreated by life, it was the youth of someone who was never taught how to be alone with himself. And that very lack of inner anchor paved the way for a life that always had to outrun emotions, drink more than the sadness, and live more fiercely than his own body could endure. Everything that came later, from the breakless nights, the impulsive choices, to the irreparable losses, didn't appear randomly. It was quietly prepared from this painless but empty youth, where Vince Neil learned to live on stimulation instead of meaning, and unwittingly laid the groundwork for a life of escaping emotions through the most extreme forms, until there was nowhere left to run. And then, when that empty youth met the right time, the right city, and the right kind of music that didn't demand depth, just intensity, Vince Neil stepped into Mötley Crüe like stepping into a whirlwind, created only to swallow him whole. Success came too early, too fast, too hard, not giving a person who had never learned to stand still time to figure out where he was going. And before Vince Neil even realized who he was, the whole world was screaming his name in those thick nights of sweat, alcohol and flashing lights. The stage, which should have been a place to express himself, gradually became a place to hide himself, because as long as he stood under those lights, he didn't have to feel the emptiness that had followed him since his teens, didn't have to face the quiet void still waiting every time the music stopped. On stage, Vince Neil was clearly defined, the lead singer, the icon, the center of the chaos. But backstage, when all the cheers faded, he was back to being a person who didn't know what to do with the silence. Alcohol, drugs and lust, therefore, didn't appear as simple depraved pleasures. They were survival tools, temporary medications to keep him from facing the hardest question of his life. If there were no lights, no screams, no crowd's hunger, then who was Vince Neil left as? Every show was a chance to erase himself in sound intensity, every party a way to prolong the no-thinking state, and every new extreme a desperate effort to keep the feeling alive sensation from disappearing. Mötley Crüe's success didn't give Vince Neil time to mature alongside it. Everything was amplified too much, from the praise to the excess, and in that world stopping to ask questions was seen as unacceptable weakness. He learned to live as if tomorrow didn't exist, not because of some free-living philosophy, but because if there was a tomorrow, he'd have to face himself, face the voids fame couldn't fill. Gradually, the line between the real person and the stage character blurred until it was indistinguishable, and Vince Neil began to exist mostly as a reflection of outside expectations, a voice tied to partying, rebellion and pleasure, more than an individual with his own inner life. In that spin, alcohol was no longer a choice but a habit, drugs no longer an experiment but a need, lust no longer a desire, but the only way to feel he could still respond. The stage gave him everything, but it also quietly took away his ability to live without it, because every time he stepped off, the real world felt too small, too slow and too quiet to bear. Vince Neil didn't realize what he was trading away, because at that height, loss doesn't show up right away, it just accumulates, waiting until it can no longer be hidden. Mötley Crüe, with all the madness and freedom it represented, became the perfect mask so he wouldn't have to face himself, but that same mask made him forget what it felt like to live without playing a role. When fame becomes an addiction, people no longer chase music or joy, they chase the feeling of existing in other people's gaze. And Vince Neil, without even knowing it, began to lose the ability to live an ordinary life, where worth doesn't need to be proven by intensity, where silence is no longer the enemy. At some point he couldn't yet name, the stage lights were no longer just a place to perform, they became the only place he felt real, and that was the most dangerous moment, because once a person only exists when seen, they collapse the instant that gaze turns away. When the whole world started calling Vince Neil a legend, when his name was printed huge on posters, when stadiums were packed with people screaming along to every lyric, that was also when a silent disintegration began from the inside, slow but irreversible, because the peak of his career didn't come as a reward, but as constant pressure forcing him to maintain an image he no longer had the strength to carry. Fame at this stage was no longer a door opening to the future, it became a gilded cage, where each successful show only made the next day feel more empty, because the feeling of victory had already been consumed before it could even appear. Vince Neil was hailed as the embodiment of the era, but in his private life, the closest relationships began to crack under the weight of a man always living in extremes, where presence only truly existed with an audience, while listening, patience, and attachment were seen as demands too slow. Family, instead of being a refuge, became an exhausting battlefield of broken promises, long absences, and repeated arguments, where marriages fell apart not because of one single moment of betrayal, but because of the prolonged absence of someone who had grown accustomed to living for the crowd, more than for the people closest to him. Meanwhile, his body began paying the price for years without breaks, for nights that stretched into mornings, for endless tours, and for a lifestyle that treated limits as something to be smashed rather than respected. Each morning he woke up heavier than the one before, each fatigue lasted longer, but there was no room to stop, because the machine called Mötley Crüe was running at full speed, and any slowdown was seen as a sign of weakness. Success at this point no longer brought the feeling of being recognized, it only created a new obligation, forcing Vince Neil to keep being the version the public expected, even when he no longer recognized himself in it. The applause rang out regularly, but it no longer reached inside, because each time he was cheered also reminded him that his worth now depended entirely on his ability to maintain the intensity, maintain the image, maintain the chaos, and the moment that intensity dropped, they would turn their backs as quickly as they had once loved him. The growing emptiness began to creep into the rare times without shows, without parties, without lights, and in those moments, Vince Neil faced a dangerous feeling, that even with everything people still dream of, he still couldn't find a reason to feel whole. No one told him that the peak could also be the beginning of the fall, that when a person reaches a level of worship that's too great, they no longer have space to make mistakes, to stop, to reshape themselves. Family kept drifting away, relationships broke in silence or in endless fights, and his body grew more worn out, but the wheel of fame wouldn't allow him to admit it, because admitting it meant accepting that even a legend is a human with limits. Deep down, a sense of impending disaster began to form, not as a clear prophecy, but as a vague feeling that something couldn't keep going like this forever, that with each passing year, the price to pay would no longer just be exhaustion, but irreparable losses. Vince Neil stood at the peak of his career with every eye on him, but the higher he climbed, the more he felt stripped away from normal life, pulled farther from meaningful connections, and trapped in a loop where success no longer brought joy, only the obligation to keep running faster than the emptiness chasing behind. It was during this phase, when no victory was big enough to cover the sense of hollowness, when every show ended, leaving a heavier silence, that disaster was no longer a surprise. It became an obvious possibility, something approaching slowly but surely, like a debt life had started charging interest on, and sooner or later it would come to collect in full. And then that night in 1984 came, not as a tragedy foretold, but the way the biggest mistakes usually appear in life, quietly, impulsively, and without a chance to turn back. When Vince Neil got behind the wheel drunk, carrying every habit of disregarding limits that had been nurtured through years of unchecked fame, it wasn't a thought-out decision, nor an act of malice, but it was precisely that unconsciousness that made it unforgivable, because in just a few seconds of losing control, a car sped off, a collision happened, and one person never got the chance to come back. Razzle, the drummer of Hanoi Rocks, died that night, and with that death, an invisible line had been crossed, the line between the wild antics of rock and roll and the irreversible consequences of real life. There's no way to retell it that makes the event lighter, no explanation strong enough to make that death less heavy, and no perspective that allows softening the truth, that from that moment, Vince Neil's life veered in a direction he could never return from. even though he was still breathing, still standing on stage, still called a star. That accident didn't just take one life, it permanently ended the illusion that everything could be wiped clean with money, lawyers and time, because some deaths refused to fade from memory, refused to be silenced by applause, and refused to make way for any legend. Vince Neil didn't make excuses, didn't try to retell the story in a way that favored him, because deep inside every explanation became meaningless in the face of one raw truth: a person died, and he was the one driving that night. Legal consequences could be handled, a sentence could be handed down, probation could be served, but the real sentence wasn't in the courtroom. It began the moment Vince Neil had to keep living while knowing he was still here, and someone else wasn't. From after that night, every morning waking up was no longer just the aftermath of a long party. It was an uncomfortable reminder that he had crossed a line no one can cross and return from unchanged. That some mistakes don't end when the stage lights come on. They follow a person to the end of life like a shadow that can't be shaken off. Fame didn't vanish immediately. Mötley Crüe kept going. Shows kept happening. But from the inside, something had shattered beyond repair, because from then on every cheer carried a silent question no one in the crowd could hear. Why is he still standing there? Why is he still allowed to live, when the price of that night was a life that ended forever? Vince Neil began living with that question, not as a philosophy, but as an open wound without an answer, without a conclusion, only the prolonged existence of unspoken guilt. What used to be harmless rebellion now carried a different color, because every impulsive act echoed the memory of that night. Every time limits were pushed, reminded him that limits had once been crossed with irreparable consequences. He could no longer drink like before without remembering the night that took a life, could no longer get behind the wheel without feeling the weight of responsibility, and could no longer stand in front of a crowd fully believing he deserved their worship. The 1984 accident didn't instantly turn Vince Neil into a different person, but it began the slow and cruel process of stripping away his carefreeness, forcing him to live in a half-awake, half-numb state, where life continued on the outside but inside there was always a heavy silence. That was the moment fame stopped being armor, and became an ironic backdrop for a personal tragedy that would never close, because every new success couldn't erase the fact that someone never got the chance to keep living. Vince Neil didn't choose to carry that story for pity, he carried it as an unshakable burden, a part of himself no show was loud enough to fully hide. From that night onward, the question, "Why am I still here?" didn't appear as a fleeting thought, it became an undercurrent running through the rest of his life, seeping into every rare quiet moment, into every gap between songs, into every morning waking up long after the stage lights had gone out. It wasn't a question looking for an answer, it was a question that existed to remind him that some prices are never fully paid, that sometimes continuing to live isn't a reward, it's the longest punishment a person can carry. After that night in 1984, Vince Neil didn't disappear, didn't withdraw, and didn't choose to lock himself in the shadows like many might have imagined. He returned to the stage, exactly as the world expected from a rock star, but that return no longer carried the innocence of the years before, because from that moment on, no step on stage felt light anymore. The lights still came on, the music still roared, the crowd still screamed his name, as if nothing had happened, but inside Vince Neil, every round of applause rang alongside another sound, deeper, heavier, and no one but him could hear it. No one standing below the stage mentioned the death of another person that night, no song paused to pay tribute, no collective moment forced him to bow his head, but it was precisely that silence that made the burden so brutal, because it forced him to carry that memory alone, day after day, as an inseparable part of his very existence. Vince Neil understood very clearly that the stage wasn't a place for atonement, that no performance could ever balance out a life that was lost, and that's why every time he stood in front of tens of thousands of people, he didn't feel forgiven, he only felt the cruel contradiction between being cheered and knowing he didn't deserve any sense of relief. Life went on, the tour schedule stayed packed, albums still sold well, and the wheel of fame didn't slow down to let him process what had happened, but from the inside, a boundary had been permanently broken, making every joy afterward carry a bitter aftertaste. Vince Neil no longer drank just to have fun, no longer partied just to chase pleasure, because from then on, Every action that crossed a line unintentionally brought back the memory of a line that had once been crossed with irreparable consequences. There were shows that ended in endless cheers, but when he stepped backstage, he felt a heavier emptiness than any silence, because the external excitement couldn't erase the feeling that a part of him had been permanently trapped in that night in 1984. No one forced him to remember, no one made him carry the guilt, but the very act of continuing to live, continuing to be loved, continuing to be called a legend, became a constant reminder that there was an injustice that couldn't be explained, that he got to keep living while someone else didn't. From that point, Vince Neil's life was no longer a string of carefree days. It became a fragile balance between continuing to exist and never forgetting the reason that existence had become so uncomfortable. Every morning he woke up, that memory didn't scream, didn't appear as a clear nightmare, it just lay there quietly, waiting for the most unexpected moments to surface. When he sat alone in a hotel room after a show, when the music had stopped, when the alcohol was no longer strong enough to blur the thoughts, Vince Neil didn't talk much about it, didn't turn it into a story to seek sympathy, because he understood that some losses don't belong to the public, and retelling them doesn't make them any lighter. But that very prolonged silence made the guilt become a familiar part of life, not as sharp as at first, but persistent, enduring, and never fully disappearing. From after that night, every round of applause was no longer just recognition, it was also a test, forcing him to ask himself how he would live with being loved while carrying a question without an answer. The stage, once the perfect refuge, now became a two-sided space, giving him a reason to keep going, while reminding him there was no place far enough to escape the memory. Vince Neil kept standing there, singing the songs that made his name, but inside, he knew very clearly that from then on, nothing would ever return to its original state, that the carefreeness had died along with the man in 1984. Continuing to live after someone else's death wasn't a victory, nor a privilege. It was a heavy state of existence, where every passing day carried the same silent question, and from that moment, Vince Neil's life was no longer light, no longer simple, and no longer allowed him to believe that every mistake could be left behind. Then came the moment when Vince Neil could no longer cling to the very thing that had once saved him from emptiness. When he left Mötley Crüe, not just as a personnel change in the band, but as an expulsion from the only home he had ever known how to inhabit. The departure didn't happen in glory or understanding. It happened amid tension, exhaustion, and conflicts that had built up too long, where no one had the patience left to wait for a man slowly running out of control to pull himself together. To the outside world, it was just another noisy rock and roll breakup, but for Vince Neil, it was the collapse of his identity, because for so many years he wasn't just a member of Mötley Crüe. In his own mind, he was Mötley Crüe, the voice, the face, the center of the chaos that had given him a reason to exist. When that door closed, he didn't just lose the band, he lost the only structure that had kept him standing after what happened, lost the familiar stage where he could hide in the noise, and lost the simple explanation for why he woke up each morning. No more packed schedules, no more name calls before showtime. Vince Neil faced long days for the first time that weren't defined by a crowd, and in that silence, the meaninglessness became clearer than any scandal that had ever followed him. His solo career was launched like an effort to pull himself back from the widening void, but those releases didn't bring a sense of victory, didn't create enough echo to replace what was lost, and more importantly, they no longer gave him the feeling of being shielded by a collective. Every solo album, every scattered tour reminded him that the lights no longer shone bright enough to erase the truth that he had been separated from the main current of the legend he had helped build. The public compared, the media dissected, and in those cold reviews, Vince Neil didn't just see commercial failure, he saw a more painful truth. Without Mötley Crüe, he didn't know what he was singing for anymore. Scandals which had once been a familiar part of his life, now even felt more bearable than this invisible emptiness, because scandals at least proved people still remembered him, while meaninglessness left no trace, made no noise, drew no criticism. It just quietly eroded day after day. Vince Neil realized he had lost the ability to exist without a noisy scene surrounding him, that for years he hadn't built an inner life strong enough to stand alone, and now stripped from the very thing that had protected him, he was forced to face a void bigger than guilt or public judgment. No more band to blame, no more collective to lean on. He stood before the question that the music had always drowned out. If no one is calling his name on posters anymore, if no thousands are waiting for a show, then who is Vince Neil, besides a man carrying a heavy past, and not knowing where to put it? The months and years after leaving Mötley Crüe weren't a series of dramatic events, they were a slow erosion, where every small failure built into a prolonged sense of disorientation, where continuing to make music no longer came from belief, but from the fear of disappearing completely. Vince Neil didn't collapse right away, but he began living in a suspended state, no longer at the peak, not yet hitting bottom, a state more exhausting than any fall, because it allowed no clear ending. It was during this time that he understood the most painful thing wasn't being criticized or hated. It was when his existence no longer generated any response, when no one truly needed his presence anymore. Cast out from the very thing that had once saved him, Vince Neil faced the raw truth that fame wasn't just something that lifted him, it was also what made him forget how to stand on his own, and when it left, he was forced to look straight at a life without a ready script, without cheers to fill the gaps, only the vast cold meaninglessness that couldn't be hidden. And then while Vince Neil was still fumbling in the emptiness after Mötley Crüe, when his identity, the stage, and his reason for existing, had all become fragile, life dealt him a blow that no rebellion, no drunkenness, no stimulant could numb. His daughter Skylar Neil was diagnosed with cancer. It wasn't bad news arriving amid the chaos of rock and roll, it was a cold clinical fact, stripped of symbolism, without a stage, without a crowd, just hospital rooms, the smell of antiseptic, and emotionless numbers on medical charts. Vince Neil, the man who had once lived as if he were untouchable, who had crossed so many lines, and still stood tall, faced for the first time something that couldn't be negotiated, couldn't be challenged, and couldn't be defeated by intensity, because cancer doesn't care about fame, isn't intimidated by legends, and isn't subdued by recklessness. In those hospital hallways, where machines beeped instead of music playing, Vince Neil was no longer a star, no longer an icon, no longer the man who could shout louder than fear. He was only a powerless father standing beside a small bed, where his daughter lay, growing thinner each day, weaker with every breath, while he found no way to switch roles, to take the pain for her, to shoulder the disease in her place. No alcohol was strong enough to make him forget Skylar's eyes when the pain hit, no stimulant fast enough to cover the fear that every passing evening might bring her one step closer to the unacceptable, and it was in that raw helplessness that the entire escape mechanism he had built his whole life began to crack. Vince Neil had once believed that if he just sped up, just pushed everything to the extreme, the pain would be left behind, but with Skylar there was nowhere to run, no lights to hide in, and no role that could let him temporarily forget the reality unfolding right in front of him. Those months weren't dramatic in a cinematic sense, no clear climax, just accumulated exhaustion, tiny hopes raised and then extinguished, hushed conversations with doctors, heavy nods, and a growing sense of powerlessness, as he realized some battles can't be won, no matter how many wild storms a person has survived. For Vince Neil, watching Skylar fight day after day shattered every illusion of control he had ever held, because for years he had been used to consequences, only landing on himself, used to every mistake being offset by endurance, but this time the price was placed on a child, and he had no right to accept or refuse it. The fear of losing her didn't come as one single shock, it seeped into every small moment, every morning waking with fragile hope that today might be better than yesterday, every evening closing with wordless guilt that he had wasted so many years on meaningless things, while the time with his daughter was so finite. Vince Neil couldn't escape into music, because in that hospital room, no song was loud enough to drown out Skylar's labored breathing, no melody strong enough to erase the image of a child enduring things that should never belong to childhood. When Skylar smiled, it was a joy so fragile it hurt, because it came with the thought that the smile might not last, and when Skylar cried, Vince Neil could only stand there, helpless, realizing that all the survival skills he had once prided himself on were useless against his own child's pain. When Skylar passed away, that moment didn't explode like a stage tragedy. No sound, no lights, just a thick silence where a part of Vince Neil's world collapsed without any warning sign to let him prepare. Skylar's death wasn't like the other losses in his life, because it couldn't be filed under mistakes, couldn't be seen as a consequence of lifestyle, and couldn't be rationalized by any rock and roll philosophy or fate. This wasn't a price he agreed to pay, it was something taken from him, and that difference made it unbearable. When Skylar left, the entire escape mechanism Vince Neil had used his whole life officially collapsed, because there was nowhere left to run without carrying this pain, no intensity big enough to make it disappear, and no reason left to pretend he could endure more by living harder. He didn't scream, didn't smash things, didn't turn the pain into a public performance. He fell into a real breaking, where every familiar reflex stopped working, where existence became a heavy effort, and where every passing day posed the same unanswerable question: how do you keep living when the worst has already happened, and no redemption can bring your daughter back? Skylar Neil wasn't just a loss, she was the central breaking point of Vince Neil's life. The moment he was no longer the untouchable man, no longer the survivor fueled by intensity, but simply a father who had lost his child, carrying an inescapable pain, and from then on, everything else in his life, from fame to scandal, from success to failure, became cruelly small compared to the void Skylar left behind, a void no light could reach, no music could fill, and no years could erase. After Skylar's death, Vince Neil entered the longest and heaviest phase of his life, not with the familiar screams of rock and roll, but with a silence so prolonged, it became almost invisible. No more extreme reactions, no more destructive nights as self-punishment, no more need to turn pain into noise to force the world to see, because some losses are so vast that any form of protest becomes ridiculous. Vince Neil no longer rebelled, not because he had learned calm, but because this pain didn't allow rebellion. It couldn't be provoked, couldn't be pushed back, couldn't be overpowered. It just lay there, heavy and persistent, as an inseparable part of his daily breathing. After his daughter's funeral, there was no rise from the ashes moment, no symbolic life-changing decision, just days passing slowly, where every morning began with the same unavoidable truth: Skylar would never grow up, would never come back, and nothing in the future would ever be big enough to balance that out. Vince Neil didn't talk much about that pain, didn't bring it to the stage, didn't turn it into lyrics or a message, because some losses, when put into words, become cheap, and he understood that silence is sometimes the only way to keep the pain from being distorted. Those around him might see him continue to appear, continue to work, continue to live, but no one saw the vast majority of the remaining time, when he sat alone with memories that didn't need to be recalled because they had never left. The pain after losing a child doesn't fade with time the way people hope, it only shifts to a permanent state, less sharp but deeper, rooting into every habit, every decision, every quiet moment. Vince Neil learned to live with the absence, learned to accept that there would forever be an empty chair in his mind, and that any joy appearing afterward would always come with a shadow attached. He no longer tried to run from emotions, not because he had overcome them, but because he understood there was no place far enough to run without carrying his daughter's image with him. The old survival mechanisms that had collapsed left behind a man without strong reflexes anymore, without the need to prove anything, only trying to maintain existence in the quietest way possible. That silence wasn't healing. It didn't make Vince Neil better or wiser in a positive sense. It just made him different, quieter, heavier, and farther from the image of the man who once lived on intensity. In the silence, he realized some pains don't need to be resolved, don't need to be understood, they just need to be carried, as a part of himself, even if that makes every day harder. Evenings grew longer, mornings heavier, and time, instead of blurring the memory, only made the presence of the loss so familiar it was frightening. Vince Neil didn't find new meaning in the pain, didn't turn it into motivation, because a child's death isn't a lesson, it's a purposeless wound, and continuing to live wasn't heroic, It was just the natural reflex of a person who hasn't yet vanished. In this phase he didn't need an audience, didn't need applause, didn't need attention, because all of those things had become tiny compared to the truth that a part of his life had stopped forever. That prolonged silence wasn't a pause between two noisy chapters, it was a new state of existence, where everything moved slower, with less color, and without the illusion that time would fix everything. Vince Neil continued living in silence, not because he had accepted the pain, but because he no longer had the energy to fight it, and it was in that passive acceptance that his life moved into another phase, where the noise of the past had gone quiet, leaving only a man carrying a constant pain, not exploding, not disappearing, but there every day, reminding him that some losses never become old stories, they only become a permanent part of how we exist in this world. After that prolonged silence, when the pain no longer needed screams to exist, Vince Neil began to realize that life doesn't just collect debts through memories, it also collects through the very body he once considered untouchable. The years of abuse didn't come to claim repayment right away, they waited, accumulated, and then appeared as a non-negotiable truth. When Vince Neil gained weight, got short of breath, and gradually lost the voice that had once been his strongest weapon, his body didn't collapse in one dramatic moment, it betrayed him slowly, every movement heavier, every lyric more labored, every morning waking up with a fatigue of unclear origin that never went away. That was the price of a breakless life, of treating limits as the enemy, of believing endurance could stretch forever if you were stubborn enough. And when the body finally spoke up, it didn't need to scream, simply refusing to cooperate was enough to shatter every illusion. Vince Neil had once used his body as a tool to escape emotions, to drink more than the sadness, to sing louder than the emptiness, but by this point, that very body no longer allowed him to play that role, forcing him to face the reality that time can't be outrun by intensity. The stage, once his final refuge, now became the cruelest place to expose decline, because no light was bright enough to hide the shortness of breath, no sound system loud enough to conceal the exhaustion etched into every movement. Every performance was no longer a meeting between artist and audience, it was a brutal test, where Vince Neil had to wrestle with his own body in front of thousands of eyes, where every mistake was recorded, analyzed and mocked as proof that the legend had run its course. The criticism didn't just target his voice or appearance, it unwittingly dug deeper into a quieter fear, that he was trapped inside his own image, forced to show up even when his body could no longer deliver, because disappearing completely seemed even more terrifying than being exposed. Vince Neil couldn't blame anyone but himself, because he had lived as if the body was something that could be spent without limit, and now, as it began demanding repayment installment by installment, he had no choice but to pay, with every breath, every step, every note that no longer rang like before. There were nights on stage amid cheers mixed with boos, when Vince Neil understood very clearly that the audience wasn't just watching a show, they were watching time pass over a man who didn't stop when he still could. Every performance became a wordless reminder that time had run out, that there wasn't enough room left to start over, and that every effort to cling to the past only made the present more painful. Yet he still stepped out on stage, not out of confidence, not because he believed he was still at the top, but because it was the only place he knew how to exist after all the losses he had been through. The body's betrayal didn't make Vince Neil collapse immediately, but it took away the last thing that helped him forget the pain, forcing him to stand there with full exhaustion, full decline, with no shield left except his own raw presence. In that state, every song was no longer a happy memory, it was a heavy recollection. Every round of applause no longer meant recognition, it felt like a prolonged goodbye, and every time he stepped off stage, Vince Neil felt more clearly than ever that his body had begun collecting the debt in earnest, that time was no longer on his side, and that from then on every public appearance would no longer be a comfortable choice. It was a decision carrying full awareness of his own finitude. In that decline, there was no explosive tragedy, only a slow process, where every show was a self-reminder that the breakless years had come to an end, and that the final price for living beyond limits had arrived, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy enough to be impossible to ignore. After his body began showing decline that could no longer be hidden, Vince Neil had to face a reality even crueler than physical pain. The public's patience had run out. The world that once worshipped him no longer wanted to witness a legend aging, because people loved the memory more than the living person in front of them. Performances were clipped into short videos, spreading at lightning speed, where every missed breath, every heavy step became material for mockery. Vince Neil's image was no longer seen as a man fighting time. It was distorted into a meme, a joke, a symbol of downfall that the internet could consume quickly and then forget. Cold comments appeared in droves, not with curiosity or empathy, only the impatience of a crowd that didn't want to wait, didn't want to understand, and certainly didn't want to witness the truth that every legend eventually pays with their own body. No one asked Vince Neil what he was carrying inside when he stepped on stage with that labored breathing. No one asked what losses he had lived with, how much pain he had buried behind the lights, or how hard he had to push himself to keep showing up, even knowing each appearance could become evidence against him. The public only saw the surface, the digestible part, the part that could be judged in a few seconds of scrolling, and in that world, the complexity of a human life had no place. Vince Neil wasn't allowed to age normally, wasn't allowed to weaken without being ridiculed, because his image had been permanently frozen in the past, in the years when his voice was still sharp, his body still lean, and every mistake covered by the intensity of rock and roll. Once shaped, that icon became the very frame imprisoning the real person. Every time Vince Neil appeared in his current state, he wasn't just compared to other artists, he was compared to his own younger self, a comparison no one could win. In many eyes, he was no longer a man continuing to live. He was an incomplete relic, something that should be displayed in memory rather than existing in the present. And when an icon is frozen too long, any movement is seen as distortion, any effort to continue as superfluous. It was in that context that Vince Neil began to clearly feel what it was like to become superfluous in his own legend. He wasn't directly chased away, there was no statement saying he should stop, but the growing indifference, the constant mockery, and the absence of understanding said it all. The world no longer needed the present-day Vince Neil, only the past one, and that created a painful paradox. To be loved, he had to become someone who no longer existed. Every time he stood on stage, he wasn't just facing his body's decline, he was facing the gaze of people who had already decided he no longer had a place in the story they wanted to tell. That judgment didn't come from one source. It came from countless small voices combining into an invisible wall, making Vince Neil gradually understand that not everyone was willing to watch a person keep living after the legend had fulfilled its entertainment role. In the world of social media, where everything is reduced to images and instant reactions, there was no space for silence, for unspoken pain, or for losses that couldn't be illustrated with a short caption. Vince Neil was no longer seen as a man who had survived many upheavals. He was an illustration of decay that people both feared and mocked to reassure themselves. Yet the most painful thing wasn't the criticism, it was the absence of the right questions. No one asked why he still stepped on stage, why he didn't choose to disappear quietly, or why he accepted being exposed to the harshness of public opinion. The public's impatience didn't just strip away empathy, it stripped away the right to explain, forcing Vince Neil to exist in a void where every action was interpreted in the most negative way. He was no longer the center of the story, he became the object for others to tell the story their way, a simplified story, lacking depth, leaving no room for the complexity of a human being. In that state, Vince Neil kept moving forward, not because he believed he could regain the lost love, but because he had grown used to being misunderstood, used to carrying labels that didn't reflect the full truth. Becoming superfluous in his own legend didn't make him collapse immediately, but it added a new layer of loneliness to an already heavy life, a loneliness that came from knowing that even in the middle of a crowd, he wasn't seen as a living person, but as a fading memory that people hadn't yet bothered to put away. And in that coldness, Vince Neil continued to exist, not to prove anything to the world, but to face himself, in a reality where patience had run out, but existence still couldn't end. After becoming superfluous in his own legend, Vince Neil stood before the question the public kept asking, but rarely wanted to hear answered: Why doesn't he disappear? Not because he hoped for a comeback, not because the future promised anything better, and not because of some vague belief that time would return what was lost. Vince Neil stayed for a far rawer reason. He no longer allowed himself to run one more time. Throughout his entire life, he had learned to escape too well, escaping in music, in intensity, in lights, in long nights, where feeling was overwhelmed by stimulation, and every escape left a bigger void behind. By this point, with every familiar exit exhausted, disappearing would just be another form of running, another refusal to face what had happened, and what still existed inside him. Vince Neil understood that there was nowhere left to run without carrying his entire past with him, and it was that very understanding that kept him there. He didn't stand on stage, because he thought he could still enjoy anything. Enjoyment had left long ago, along with the carefreeness, along with the feeling of victory, along with the belief that music could save everything. The stage now was no longer a place of transcendence, it was a place of endurance, where he placed his exhausted body and heavy mind under the lights, as an acknowledgement that he was still here, that he hadn't disappeared, and that existence, even if not beautiful, was the only choice left. Every performance no longer carried the promise of joy, it carried discipline, like a silent commitment to himself, that he wouldn't run when things became the most uncomfortable. Some people believe that continuing to show up is stubbornness, a fear of being forgotten, but for Vince Neil, the bigger fear was repeating the old habit, withdrawing when faced with pain. He had done that too many times by pushing himself into extremes that numbed emotions, and the price of those escapes had been paid with irreversible losses. This time, staying didn't come with heroic colors, it wasn't packaged as an inspiring story. It was simply a heavy choice, where he accepted being seen in an imperfect state, being judged, being mocked, but not turning away. The stage, in that sense, became a deliberate space of endurance, where he stood upright, before the time that had taken so much, and said, not with words, but with presence, that he wouldn't pretend anymore. Vince Neil no longer sought forgiveness from the crowd, because he knew forgiveness doesn't come from applause. He also wasn't waiting for belated recognition, because being recognized couldn't lighten what had been lost. What he did was stay with his own truth, with the body that had collected its debts, with the pain that didn't lessen but only changed form, and with an identity no longer protected by the glow. Every step onto the stage was a reminder to himself that running wouldn't make the pain disappear, it would only make it return in another crueler form. Staying, therefore, wasn't hope, it was responsibility to the lived experience he had, a responsibility no one assigned, but one he took on himself. In that space, music was no longer medicine, it was a test of endurance. The lights were no longer a shield, they were exposure, and presence was no longer an invitation, it was an affirmation. Vince Neil didn't disappear, because he had grown too familiar with the price of disappearing, and because this time, he chose the harder way, standing still before what remained. The stage became a place of endurance, not enjoyment, but it was precisely in that endurance that he found something quieter than hope, and more enduring than the future. Honesty with himself, even if it brought no joy, promised no revival, and didn't soften the public's gaze. He stayed not to prove anything, but to not run one more time, because after all the escapes he had gone through, staying, even if painful, was the last form of courage he could still choose. After everything he had been through, when Vince Neil said he wants it to end, that statement was taken out of context, distorted, and thrown into a world always quick to conclude without the patience to listen. Many heard the word end, and immediately thought of death, as if it were a dark confession, a sign of giving up, or a belated surrender from a legend who had outlived his era. But Vince Neil wasn't talking about wanting to die, and he had never said he wanted to disappear from this world. What he wanted to end wasn't his life, it was the state of existence he had endured for too long, a state stretched thin by guilt, memories, and endless self-justification. End, in the way he said it, wasn't the final period of living, it was the desire to stop the tearing, to live without having to ask himself every day why he was still here, and why he had to keep explaining it to others. For many years, Vince Neil had lived in a silent war with memory, where old images never stayed quietly in the past. They didn't appear as violent nightmares, but as a steady, persistent flow, making him unable to forget, but also unable to face them fully. Wanting it to end first meant wanting to stop the dialogue with questions that had no answers, to stop self-punishing for things that couldn't be fixed, and to stop measuring his own worth through other people's gaze. Vince Neil wasn't seeking release by ending his life, he was seeking an inner quiet he had never had, even in his most successful years. What caused that statement to be misunderstood was that the public had grown used to seeing him as an extreme icon, where every utterance had to be dramatic, where every emotion had to be pushed to the edge. When someone like that talks about ending, people assume it must be an ultimate declaration, because this world rarely allows larger-than-life figures to speak about exhaustion in a normal way. But Vince Neil wasn't speaking the language of tragedy, he was speaking with the voice of someone who had lived too long in tension, where existence itself had become a constant justification. He was tired of proving he still deserved to be here, tired of every appearance dragging judgment, comparison, and mockery, and tired of carrying a past image on his back that no one would let him put down. Wants it to end was also the desire to end the war with memory, where every current joy was pulled back to old losses. Vince Neil didn't want to forget, because forgetting was impossible, and also unfair, but he wanted to stop being controlled by memory in every reaction, every emotion, every decision. He wanted to live in the present without constantly being reminded of who he once was, what he had lost, and where he had gone wrong. In that sense, end wasn't disappearance, it was stopping the tearing between past and present, between public image and real person. More importantly, that statement reflected the desire to end having to justify his own existence. Vince Neil had survived events many couldn't imagine, but instead of being seen as a person who had endured, he was often viewed as a problem that needed explaining. Why does he still stand on stage? Why hasn't he stopped? Why doesn't he disappear quietly? Those questions, repeated over and over, turned his existence into something that required justification, as if continuing to live had to be defended by achievements, image or perfection. And in that context, was the desire to stop explaining, to stop answering questions that didn't come from care but from judgment. Vince Neil didn't want to die because if he did, he wouldn't have kept showing up, wouldn't have kept enduring, and wouldn't have stayed in a world that was no longer kind to him. What he wanted was to end the prolonged tearing, where every passing day was a struggle between staying and bearing it. End was stopping the fight with his own existence, allowing himself to live without having to win, without having to prove, and without having to be fully understood. In that correct understanding, the seemingly bleak statement carried a different meaning, not a call for death, but a call for peace, for a less painful form of existence, where Vince Neil could be here without having to tear himself apart every day to prove that his being alive was reasonable. And at this point in the story, when every explanation had become superfluous, Vince Neil stood in a place very few want to look straight at, not forgiven but having paid enough. History doesn't embrace him as a mirror to be protected. It doesn't place him on the altar of complete redemption. It also doesn't rewrite the past to make it easier to accept. Vince Neil isn't called a role model because his life has too many cracks to be framed as a simple moral lesson. But precisely because of that, his story isn't one of whitewashing. It's the story of living with consequences right up to today without running, without denying, and without trying to erase what happened. Some people are forgiven by history because they managed to fix their mistakes in a way that's easy to see, turn suffering into beautiful messages, package tragedy into inspiring journeys. Vince Neil isn't one of them. He doesn't have a clear redemption moment, no milestone that makes everyone nod and say from here on out, everything's okay. What he has is a long stretch of days where consequences don't lessen, they just change shape, where memories aren't resolved, they're just carried, and where existence itself has become a form of accountability. He isn't forgiven in the way the public usually understands forgiveness, because forgiveness demands a neat story, and his life isn't neat. Instead of being embraced, Vince Neil is placed on the edge, where mistakes are never forgotten, and losses are never balanced. But that doesn't mean he hasn't paid the price. On the contrary, the price he pays isn't in one single sentence, or one accepted apology, it's in having to keep living in a life that doesn't allow forgetting. Paying enough, in Vince Neil's case, isn't making everything disappear, it's not allowing himself to disappear in order to escape. He doesn't run from the memories, even though they're painful. He doesn't deny responsibility, even though it's heavy, and he doesn't erase the past, even though that might make the present easier to breathe in. Not being embraced by history means no safety buffer, no protection from judgmental stares. Vince Neil lives in a space where every mistake is always ready to be brought up again, where his existence is never fully separated from what happened. But it's precisely in that space that continuing to live, continuing to show up, continuing to endure becomes a rare form of responsibility. He doesn't try to rewrite the story to make it prettier, doesn't push the pain into some generic message, and doesn't use time as an excuse to blur the consequences. He accepts that some things can't be fixed, they can only be carried. Not being called a role model also means not having to carry the expectation of perfection. Vince Neil doesn't represent the triumph of morality or the rebirth of character. He represents a more uncomfortable truth. Some people are never fully forgiven, but they still have to keep living honestly with what they've caused and what they've lost. He doesn't demand sympathy, doesn't require recognition, and doesn't try to turn pain into an emotional commodity. His presence, even exhausted, even without the glow, is proof that paying the price doesn't always come with release. In a world that loves neat endings, Vince Neil is an unfinished ending, where responsibility has no expiration date and consequences have no end date. He isn't embraced by history, but he's also not allowed to escape history, and it's right in between those two states that he exists, not a hero, not a victim, just a man who has lived too long with his own choices. No running, no denying, no erasing, just continuing to carry it, day by day, with the awareness that paying enough doesn't bring relief, but it brings something else, quieter and harder to see, ultimate honesty with the life he's lived. And then the story returns to the present, where Vince Neil sits there, heavier, slower, not trying anymore to adjust his image to fit anyone's expectations. He doesn't stand before the public as a winner, nor as someone defeated, but as a man who has walked every path life forced him to walk, carrying every loss, every mistake, every consequence without the privilege of leaving them behind. At this point, when Vince Neil talks about ending, he doesn't speak in the language of despair, nor in the voice of someone giving up. He speaks with the deep exhaustion of a man who has lived too long in a state of fighting himself. Ending is no longer tied to death, because if that were what he wanted, he wouldn't be here, wouldn't have stood firm through years of scrutiny, mockery, misunderstanding. The ending Vince Neil refers to is the end of a decades-long inner tearing, where every passing day is a silent battle between memory and present, between responsibility and burnout, between staying and wanting peace. He doesn't want to die. He wants to live without having to prop up every moment with willpower. He wants to wake up without having to ask himself what he still needs to prove. He wants to exist without being forced to represent the past, the legend, the mistakes that have been repeated until they're worn thin. Ending here is stopping the fight with himself, stopping the strain of every breath to keep himself standing in the face of what happened. It's the desire for peace, not in the sense of escape, but in the sense of no longer having to brace against his own existence. Honoring Vince Neil at this ending isn't because he won, because winning implies someone lost, and in his life no one truly lost. There were only irreversible losses. He didn't win against the accident, didn't win against his daughter's death, didn't win against time, his body or public judgment, but he exists after all of it, and that existence is far from easy. It's an existence that isn't beautified, isn't embraced by history, isn't fully forgiven, but it continues honestly. Vince Neil didn't leave the world when it turned harsh, didn't disappear when his own legend became too big a shadow, and didn't choose to erase the past to make the present more comfortable. He stayed with the full weight of his life, and that's what makes this story not an epic, but a painful acknowledgement of the real price of survival. When looking at Vince Neil today, what's left isn't the glow, isn't the songs that once shook a generation. It's a man who has endured enough that he no longer needs to prove anything. He doesn't demand sympathy, doesn't ask to be understood correctly, because some lives can't be summed up in a neat conclusion. What he wants after everything is just the bare minimum of peace, a state where he can exist without fighting his own memories anymore, without justifying why he's still here, and without living as if every day is a final test. And it's at that point that the story closes, not with redemption, but with acknowledgement. Some men aren't remembered for how brightly they lived, aren't recorded for clear victories or easy-to-swallow lessons. If they're remembered at all, it's for how much pain they carried, and never ran from. Vince Neil is one of them, not perfect, not fully forgiven, but also not running from what could have killed someone else. And when he says he just wants it to end, what he wants to end isn't life, it's the long inner war that has taken too much. To live, finally, not to fight anymore, just to be at peace. Some men aren't remembered for how they lived, but for how much pain they carried, and never ran from. The story of Vince Neil isn't an epic of victory, it's a painful record of the real price of surviving so many losses. From the peak with Mötley Crüe, where fame came too early and too hard, to the night of the 1984 accident that took another life, Vince Neil entered a journey where every day of existence carried the question, why am I still here? The story shows he doesn't avoid the consequences, he keeps living in silent guilt, returns to the stage aware that every cheer comes with memories that can't be erased. The greatest tragedy, his daughter Skylar's death from cancer, completely shattered every escape mechanism he once used: alcohol, extremes, intensity, to hide the pain. After that moment, Vince Neil no longer screams, no longer rebels, only a prolonged silence remains, where the pain doesn't lessen but becomes constant. For American audiences, this story is a reminder that society often celebrates success and quickly turns its back when an icon ages, weakens, or no longer fits the past image. Vince Neil being mocked on social media, frozen in the image of an old legend, shows the public's impatience and lack of empathy toward a very human process of decline. The lesson here isn't in admiring or justifying mistakes, it's in the ability to look straight at reality. Some people aren't embraced by history, aren't fully forgiven, but still choose not to run. Vince Neil isn't honored for winning, he's honored for existing after things that could have killed someone else, and sometimes in real life, the greatest courage is simply continuing to live honestly with one's own consequences. If the story of Vince Neil makes you think about the real price of survival, and not running from pain, subscribe to the channel to keep joining us. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we'll continue looking straight at the lives behind the spotlight.